Mr. Dali, we're going to talk in English, which I know is not your language, but I'm sure you're going to manage wonderfully.
Yes, my English remain very, very problematic, but this is not so important because see somebody catch only a little piece of my ideas, this is absolutely sufficient because Dalinian ideas possess one tremendous power of germination.
Well, I quite see that. The first question that I wanted to put to you, it really ought to be about modern art, but I can't help it. There's some delicious frivolity in you which makes me ask it, is how did you manage to produce those marvelous moustaches?
In the beginning of this moustache, use one very natural product, the dates, you know, the fruit.
I know.
In the last moment of dinner, not clean my fingers,
Yes.
only put a little in my moustache, remain for all afternoon very
Standing up.
efficiently.
Well, and that's how it began.
Yes, but now use one real product, very good, in the Place Vendôme, is Hungarian wax.
Oh, yes.
Pinot. It's very well-known wax, is already Proust, Marcel Proust used the same.
Yes, but his was a little pointed one, wasn't it? It didn't have a splendid upturn
Yes,
like yours.
use this wax, use this wax in one other manner, in one other mood, in one depressing psychosis way.
Yes,
you
I
know,
see.
a little depressing and melancholic. My moustache, contrary, is very gay,
Very
very
gay.
pointed, very aggressive.
Do you have any trouble with it at night? I mean, do you have to peg it or anything like that, or does it stand up at night?
No, in the night, clean every night. They come in soft, sleep.
So at night it droops down while you're
Completely,
sleeping.
completely.
And then in the morning up she goes again.
3 minutes, only in 3 minutes, fix my moustache.
And then you feel you can face the world with that wonderful moustache standing up.
Yes, because every day becoming much more practical for my inspiration.
Well, I'm fascinated to know that. Mr. Dali, you've come over, haven't you, to paint a portrait of Laurence Olivier?
It's exact.
How's it going?
It's very good, very good. Only work 15 minutes is almost complete.
You did the whole thing in 15 minutes.
Sur Laurence, take 2 hours for put le makeup, le nose, everything. And myself in 15 minutes accomplish the portrait. Now it's necessary only realization of this portrait. This is perhaps 1 month.
But it's
Everything is in my mean very clear and very violent.
Yes. Mr. Dali, who, apart from yourself, would you regard as a good portrait painter today?
Myself believe there no exist one
Who?
in modern time.
Nobody at all. Have you ever seen...
Picasso is the only possible create extraordinary good portraits. May not like it, this kind of activity.
Augustus John, have you ever seen any of his portraits?
It's a very big ability in the drawing, very good draftsmanship in the drawing, but the painting appear me the same characteristics of the other English painters, you know, very dirty and very melancholy, sad and depressing, very depressing.
You feel that our art as a whole suffers from an undue excess of melancholy, really? Much melancholy. I noticed you'd been to see some exhibition and there was a donkey there in it. And
Yes,
you had...
just can talk about this melancholy. Remember this exhibit. Every of one of these is very young British painters. Everyone paint the more sad and melancholic kind of animals, fish, people, houses. Everything very dirty also, only the more dirty colors and the more depressing effects.
Now, why do you think that is? Why should they all be so sad? Why should they paint this poor old donkey with such a sad,
This
sad
is one,
look?
no understand the reason that these young people is so melancholic, no understand.
No.
Because myself believe, contrary, that the modern atomic age is very gay. No, nothing is more gay the collision and explosion of intra-atomic conflicts of nuclear physics.
You feel that really livens things up enormously.
For me, is the more happy thing is look these terrific conflicts about electrons and pi mesons and atoms is everything jumping and romping in a completely extraordinary eurythmic feeling.
Yes, I see what you mean.
Myself is every day is more gay. Around me look everybody every day more sad, more depressing, and more physical and moral exhaustion.
Do you find that true in New York as well as here in poor old Europe?
No, New York in this moment offer one very big quantity of abstract painters. Myself no like it abstract painting because believe it's only one part of it's one decorative art, but these paintings of New York is plenty of vitality.
And on the whole, rather
enormous vitality, completely explosive.
Would you still call yourself a surrealist as a painter? You were originally, you belonged to the school of surrealism in Paris.
Myself believe that now, myself is the only surrealist continued this kind of inspiration.
You are in fact the sole survivor of the surrealist movement, rather.
Yes, avec la différence que myself like it, incorporate and sublimate the first experience of my life in the big classical tradition of Spanish painters. The bottom of my inspiration remain completely delirant and surrealistic.
But the school, as a school, you feel, has rather gone out of existence.
The school is disappeared because becoming one academic school with no personality. It also collapsed in this kind of sadness and melancholy of the other kind of modern schools.
I see. So that really you feel that surrealism, having started when you were with it as very gay, has now sunk into melancholy and despair, and that you alone remain as a true representative of it.
Absolutely true.
Now, all your wonderful jokes that we know about, taxi cabs with the rain inside and so on, you're going to go on with those jokes.
This corresponds to first period of my life. The moment of myself is very big interest in psychoanalysis, coming in London for meet Dr. Freud. But now my interest is only about the tremendous progress of nuclear research and nuclear physics.
And so really that represented a phase in your career, those jokes that we all knew about, and now you move on and all your life will be to the rhythm of atomic explosion.
Exactly, one new kind of atomic and nuclear mysticism.
Well, thank you very much. That's a fascinating phrase, nuclear mysticism.
Now let's meet our first contestant. Will you come in and sign in, please? Panel, as you probably have realized, there is an area of identification here that might be in appearance, costuming, name, some area of identification which would give you too much information, so you're blindfolded. I would just ask our guest if you are fully familiar with how we keep score.
Yes.
All right, then in that case, let's let the folks at home and our friends here in the theater know exactly what your line is. Guest, who must also be unnamed, is self-employed. With that, let's begin the general questioning with Arlene Francis.
Are you associated with any of the arts?
Yes.
Would you ever have been seen on television?
Yes.
Are you a performer?
Yes.
Would you be considered a leading man?
Yes.
I got to move in here. Actually, in the general context of the questioning, we would have to accept that all the affirmative replies, except perhaps the last one, are not misleading in any major degree. However, I think the last answer is misleading, and we could not accurately describe our guest as a leading man.
He's a misleading man.
Misleading man he is. 1 down and 9 to go, Mr. Third.
Have you achieved eminence in some field other than television?
Yes.
Would it be the sort of exploit that might possibly reach the front page of a newspaper?
Yes.
Is it an exploit that's been on the front page of the newspapers within the past couple of weeks?
No.
No. 2 down and 8 to go, Miss Kilgallen.
Do you imagine that we're blindfolded because one or more of us would recognize you at sight?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Are you accustomed to appearing before audiences?
Yes.
When you appear before audiences, do you ever wear less than you're wearing now?
When you appear before audiences, do you ever wear less than you are wearing now? I would say that under certain specific conditions, it is not impossible that our guest would wear less than is being worn now, but it's not necessarily germane to what it is we're trying to arrive at.
Is that a yes or a no?
That is a kind of up and down yes.
Well, all right. Do you have anything to do with sports or any form of athletic endeavor?
Yes.
Ball conference. Yes, all right. Now, I think it would be too misleading to suggest that our guest had a basic affiliation with sports. This is not to say that it is not within the compass of his enjoyment to indulge in this particular endeavor.
Thank you.
3 down and 7 to go, Mr. Lawford.
I'm still working on the last one. Do you appear continuously on television? By that I mean once a week or once a month. Can I see you?
No.
No. 4 down and 6 to go, Miss Francis.
Do you use anything in your hands for your job? Like a pencil or a typewriter or anything like that?
Yes.
Would you be considered a writer?
Would you be considered a writer?
Yes.
Yes,
There's nothing this man doesn't do. What we have to guess is an all-around man. Are you well known because of a book that has been published of yours?
Miss Arlene, if I may interrupt here, I would have to agree that we must consider that our guest is a writer.
We're going to agree that we must consider that our guest is a writer. We're going to consider it. You mean we're going to consider whether he is or whether he isn't?
No, this is merely, actually, to try and be completely fair. The talents of our guest are not encompassed entirely in this area of work.
Oh, then you can do several things. Truly, except sports.
That's a fair assumption, yeah.
Have you had... I'm terribly lost. Have you had something published?
Does our guest have something published?
Yes.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Does he write humorously?
Do you write humorously?
Yes and no.
The answer then, I think, is properly yes and no.
Oh. Could he, does he ever do any drawing like comic strips?
Do you ever do any drawing like comic strips?
Yes.
Yes?
Our guest says, yes, he does drawings like comic strips.
Is there something quite unusual about our guest?
I beg your pardon, Arlene? I missed that last one.
I just ask if there is something unusual because everything that he does, the audience laughs about.
No, there's nothing unusual, actually. This sort of thing goes on all the time.
I'm going to pass to Bennett.
Mr. Cerf?
You are a human being.
Very much so, Bennett. Very much so.
And there is no animal or dummy out there with you.
That's right. There is no animal or dummy out there with him except, perhaps...
I'm not talking about the master of ceremony.
That'll be all.
Have you ever written a book that was published by my firm?
Did Random House ever publish a book for you?
Yes.
And that'll teach you to make remarks about the master of ceremonies, sir.
Was this book published within the past year?
No.
No, that's 5 down and 5 to go, Miss Gilgallen.
Is it possible that we have not yet struck upon the major thing that our guest is famous for?
That is very possible.
He is still maintaining that he's a performer.
Well, yes, in the degree that he was asked if he had anything to do with the arts and then was asked if he was a performer, in that large context, we would have to accept that he was indeed a performer.
Well, yes, I'd love a conference, Arlene.
Was there a call for a conference?
May we have a conference, John?
You may have 15 seconds for a conference, and I'm going to give you 1 minute more to get it.
Ask if he could use his mustache to paint.
Have you a mustache that is rather well known? In fact, could you be almost caricatured just by that?
Yes.
Oh, well, thank you, Arlene. Are you Salvador Dali?
Salvador Dali is right.
Thank you very, very much. It's very enjoyable. And I will show what Neus Carbonell makes from the case, which is very, very interesting. Thank you very much for the idea of bringing Salvador Dali. Good. Let's begin.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Philip, for these two really marvelous videos that puts us on the track of the case I have going to present to you. I have entitled my case, Dali, Saving Himself from the Dead Child. Dali with Lacan. Let us take Salvador Dali as a case of a successful megalomania. I think you've seen it, how successful it was. So a case of a successful megalomania, truly successful, according to what he wrote, and I quote, "Thanks to me, the day will come when people will be forced to concern themselves with my work. That is much more effective than groping for one's personality through one's work." End of a quote. What is the painter from Figueras telling us here, if not that it is through his name that he will be able to attract interest in his work? There lies the symptom, we can say, with Lacan. His extravagant personality, as his biographers describe it, and fanatical, as Sigmund Freud said. In fact, Sigmund Freud said that he was a truly Spaniard. He was such a fanatical. You can read that in Stefan Zweig's book, The World of Yesterday is the title, El Mundo de Ayer. The World of Yesterday. Stefan Zweig describes the meeting that Dali had with Sigmund Freud, and Dali went to see Sigmund Freud, and he talked, and Freud was silent, quiet, and looking at him, and Dali left, and he never knew what Freud thought of him. And then he asked Stefan Zweig, and Stefan Zweig said, no, Freud never said anything. And then Dali read Stefan Zweig's book, The World of Yesterday, and at the end, he says that when Dali left, Freud said, "What a fanatical!" He said, "No, he's a true Spaniard. What a fanatical!" So there lies, extravagant, as the biographers describe it, and fanatical, as Sigmund Freud said, sustained and still sustains his artistic legacy. In Dali, the megalomaniac ego of the genius artist exercised the function of the ego as rectifying the wanting relationship. For Dali, his name does not supersede the imaginary ego, but acts as a name phantom that comes to knot the unknotted. The quotation I read, thanks to me, this quotation was written in 1952 and evokes the following comment by Lacan on Joyce. And this is Lacan. Why not conceive of the case of Joyce in the following terms? Isn't his desire to be an artist who would keep the whole world busy, or in any case, as many people as possible, would compensate exactly for the fact that, let's say, his father was never a father to him? End of a quote. Let us substitute here Dali for Joyce, and we obtain the logic I'm proposing to you for the case. It will be necessary to show in what particular way Salvador Dali father, because they were named the same, Salvador Dali father was not a father for Salvador Dali son, and in what way his artwork, sustained by a rectifying ego, megalomaniacal, then came to take the place of the name of the father. To do this, to try to show to write this case, I shall base myself exclusively on his writings. Dali was a great writer, as he himself said, and you've heard it, but Dali said, I am a better writer than a painter, no doubt. So I'll base myself on his writings and orient myself on Lacan's statement when he warns us that, I quote, when one writes, one may indeed touch on the real, but not on the true. So we will stick to the artist writing, following this indication. That is why I have not taken into account the biographies, which, for reasons inherent to the genre, tend to claim the truth. The proper name. Dali was named Salvador after his father, his grandfather, and a brother who died at the age of 22 months. Dali was born 9 months and 10 days after his brother died prematurely. I should clarify that the data of the time in which the brother was born and died and Salvador Dali was born, the data of the time elapsed then between his brother's death and his birth, and Salvador Dali's birth, as well as the age of the decease, come from the register of births and deaths. So from the register of births and deaths, we know that Salvador Dali's brother died at the age of 22 months, 9 months before Dali was born. But Dali himself, the artist, maintains that his brother was 7 years old when he died, and that he himself was born 3 years later. So there is some kind of difference. We don't know the reason for this discrepancy between the dates found in the official birth and death registers and what Dali himself wrote. But in any case, it can be deduced that at some point, someone, either Dali himself or someone in the family, decided to separate the two brothers in time. and I think that this is important, as I will try to tell you. References to the dead brother, as well as to his name, insist in Dali's writing. The grandeur which the painter bestowed on his name gives us the measure of the effort he had to make to emerge from the death of the subject. If Dali says in Seminar 23, and I quote, "The name that is proper to him is that with joys valorizes at the expense of the father," then Dali's proper name is that which is proper to him. Dali's own name valorizes him to the detriment of the father and the dead brother. There are repeated mentions of the name Salvador, but also of the surname Dali, which in Catalan is homophobic to the verb Dali. You know that Salvador Dali spoke Catalan, was his first language. So in Catalan, Dali is homophobic, homophonic, sorry.
Okay, the alienation of the signifier.
Yes, with the verb Dali, meaning to feel a vehement desire. Finally, the painter's name, Dali, as he himself reminds us, alludes to a vehement, you said? Vehement desire. So if Salvador, the first name, writes his Megalomania, Dali writes his jouissance. Here is how he himself describes on one occasion the passage from the name of his brother to his own name, a transformation linked to having a redemptive mission. And I quote, "My parents baptized me with the same name as my brother, Salvador, and I was destined, as my name indicates, for nothing less than to rescue painting from the void of modern art, and to do so in this abominable epoch of mechanical and mediocre catastrophes in which we have the distress and the honor to live," unquote. I assume that you all know that Salvador in Catalan means savior. Yeah.
You don't say the R at the end.
No, Salvador.
In Catalan, you don't say the R.
I can read the quote again. My parents baptized me with the same name as my brother, Salvador. It means savior, and of course refers to Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is the savior, Salvador. So my parents baptized me with the same name as my brother, Salvador, and I was destined, as my name indicates, for nothing less than to rescue painting from the void of modern art, and to do so in this abominable epoch of mechanical and mediocre catastrophes in which we have the distress and the honor to live. This is Dali. Let us remember, should it be necessary, that the name Salvador, the Savior, obviously refers to the Redeemer in Christianity. Lacan stresses the close relationship between the Redeemer and the function of the perversion. You say that in English as well, right? Perversion.
Yes, no? What do you feel?
Okay.
Version or version towards the father.
Okay. For Lacan, the idea of the Redeemer is a madcap idea, says Lacan, which reproduces a successful sadomasochistic relationship. Says Lacan that the son dies for the father in order to save humanity. This is why the Redeemer is a version of a sadomasochistic relationship. Lacan, who evokes Freud on this point, argues that the Freudian discovery of castration cancels out the Christian idea of the Redeemer, since symbolic castration prevents it. The father transmits the phallus to the son as long as there is symbolic castration. Or to put it in another way, the only phallus that the father transmits to a son is castration, insofar as the father himself is castrated. When this symbolic transmission is wanting, the delusion of redemption comes in place of the symbolic father. This is why Lacan speaks of redemption as a version of the father. However, there is in Dali the rejection of the masochistic position vis-à-vis the father. This was his fundamental rebelliousness and explains his sadistic position, a sadism on a background of masochism, as we shall see. This is to be found in the description of the inaugural moment when he assumes his name. The childhood memory that I am going to read is said during a summer Dali spent in the countryside with some family friends. Dali narrates his solitude as well as his discovery of drawing and painting. The story is also full of descriptions of his fears as well as his cruelty towards the animals he trapped and kept, and which, on the other hand, terrified him. Indeed, it is especially at this point that one can grasp how, for the child Dali, reality was threatened by what Lacan called the imaginary dissolution, as we find in the title of chapter 3 of his seminar on psychosis. Dali counted among his animals imprisoned in biscuit boxes what he called the monster of the zoo, was a lizard with 2 tails. This bifurcation plunged him into perplexity because of the void it opened up, a perplexity from which the child escaped by eating gluttonously freshly picked up fruit from the tree. There is a description of an experience of jouissance of the body described poetically as infinitely voluptuous fear. There is also an ambiguity in the narrative. On the one hand, it appears to be the narration of a regularly recurring episode, and then suddenly the narrative turns to the account of a single event. Dali feels himself called by the tower of the house, ascends it, and from the top, the megalomaniacal idea takes shape, which will remain as a defense against the real. I quote the episode. When twilight deepened, the Molí de la Torre was the house in which he was staying. Molí de la Torre was already calling me with the whole irresistible attraction of its dizzy height. I said in a low voice, "I'm coming." From the summit of this tower, I was able to continue to develop the kind of grandiose reveries which I had begun previously on the roof of my parents' house in Figueras. From the cruel, these reveries were from the cruel semi-god to the humble worker, passing through the stages of the artist to the total genius. I have always arrived at the Savior. Salvador, Salvador, Salvador. I could repeat my own name tirelessly. I knew that a sacrifice was inevitable, and with repugnant cowardice, I would look around me in the dark. For only one thing I was absolutely sure. I was not going to be the one sacrificed. So, end of a quote. So, being the savior defends the subject from the real, but on condition of occupying the sadistic position. The imaginary other. As I said, Salvador Dali was born 9 months and 10 days after the death of his brother, which, according to himself, the death of his brother, plunged his mother into absolute sadness. He was thus conceived under the conditions of an ongoing mourning, and who knows whether this mourning was ever concluded, since the portrait of his dead brother always remained in his parents' room. Dali deduced that he was conceived to replace the deceased brother and to console his parents. Dali gives a very elaborate version of what the dead brother before him meant and how he himself felt summoned to the same place, though never achieving the place reserved for the beloved brother. This left in him a mark of hatred that manifested itself in the imaginary aggressiveness towards the small others, especially if these others had a trait of phallic value. The imaginary tension lies at the basis of the rectifying ego that was his megalomania, built on an extravagant, fanatical, excessive, unpredictable, even ruthless personality. Dali writes about his effort to get out of the place to which he was summoned. In the long quotation I am about to read, Dali's position in life, what he did with the coordinates of his birth, becomes clear. In this quotation, the relationship between melancholy and megalomania emerges quite clearly. I read a quote. "I have lived death before I lived life. My brother died of meningitis at the age of 7, 3 years before my birth. My mother was upset to the depths of her being. The precociousness of this brother, his genius, his grace, his beauty, were for her as many reasons for exaltation. His disappearance was a blow from which she never recovered. This constant presence of my dead brother was felt to me both as a trauma, as if my affection had been stolen from me, and as a stimulus to overcome myself. Since then, my efforts have tended to win back my rights in life, first of all by provoking the attention, the constant interest of my relatives in me, by a kind of constant aggression. This dead brother, whose ghost welcomed me, was, so to speak, the first Dalinian devil. I consider him as a rehearsal of myself, a kind of genius taken to the last extreme. At birth, I put my feet in the footsteps of a dead man who was adored, and who through me continued to be loved even more, perhaps even more. Thanks to paranoia, that is to say, to the proud exaltation of myself, I have managed to save myself from the annulment that systematic self-doubt produces in me. I learn to live by filling with my love for myself the emptiness of an affection that was not given to me. This is how I defeated death for the first time, through pride and narcissism." End of a quote. So, imaginary aggressiveness appears very early, as he does not hesitate to reveal. At the age of 5, he threw a child off a bridge. I am going to read the whole episode as Dali writes it, because the writing reveals well the jouissance of the subject. I quote, "I was 5 years old, and it was a springtime in the village of Cambrils near Barcelona. I was walking in the country with a boy smaller than I, who had very blonde and curly hair, and whom I had known only for a short time. I want to underline this, very blonde and curly hair, because when the other has a phallic value, then we see how the aggressiveness appears. So the phallus and death is a topic I will mention later. So whom I had known only for a short time, this little boy, I was on foot and he was riding a tricycle. With my hand on his back, I helped him to push him along. We got to a bridge under construction, which had no railings of any kind. Suddenly, as most my ideas occur, I looked behind to make sure no one was watching us and gave the child a quick push off the bridge. He landed on some rocks 15 feet below. I ran home to announce the news. During the whole afternoon, blood-stained basins were brought down from the room where the child, with a badly injured head, was going to have to remain in bed for a week. The continual coming and going and the general turmoil into which the house was thrown put me in a delightful hallucinatory mood. In the small parlor, on a rocking chair, trimmed with crocheted lace that covered the back, the arms, and the cushion of the seat, I sat eating cherries. I don't recall having experienced the slightest feeling of guilt over this incident. End of a quote. Dali willingly and shamelessly exhibits his aggressiveness towards the other. In a similar way, he recounts his enuresis and encopresis, which lasted until quite late in childhood. What is most relevant in this case is how he made himself master of his excrement in order to subdue the whim of the other. By this operation, he converted the waste object into an agalma object. The boy Dali defecated in the most unthinkable places in the house: drawers, carpets, cupboards, corners of the stairs. In this way, he managed to keep everyone's attention on his shit. He used the object that the other demanded from him to subject this other to his own whim. The raising of waste to the dignity of the object was a task that occupied him all his life. In his own words, I quote, "Temporary immortality must be sought among the waste, among the excrement, and nowhere else." End of a quote. The singular transformation of the waste object bears all its relation with subduing his father's willpower. His father, as an attempt to tame the son's enuresis, bought him a beautiful red tricycle, which the father placed on top of a cupboard for display. It would be the reward for the day he did not wet the bed. This, Dali recounts, gave even more pleasure to his incontinence. I quote, "I was 8 years old, and every morning I asked myself the same question: the tricycle or wetting the bed? After reflecting, sure of humiliating my father, I would calmly release the dribble between the sheets." End of a quote. Dali certainly gloats, no, in giving examples of humiliating his father. His memories are full of humiliations of the father. So, the humiliated and the resurrected father. Dali doesn't say much about who his father was. From Dali himself, we only know that his father was a notary of a certain social standing in a provincial town of poor peasants and even poorer fishermen. Dali describes his father as moody, authoritarian, a free thinker, and a student of Esperanto. But above all, Dali goes into detail about the son's war against the father, the origin of which lies in a wanting relationship. The "you are my son" that institutes the paternal function was missing. There was no father instituted by the transmission of symbolic castration. Indeed, a failed transmission and a response to it is deduced from the following quotation. I quote, "When my father rested his gaze on me, he was looking at my brother as much as at myself. In his eyes, I was only half of myself, or a substitute. My soul writhed in pain and rage under that laser that drilled it ceaselessly in search of the other who no longer existed. Drowned in the corset of the image of the other imposed on me, I tried to breathe, to debate vigorously as when one drowns, to conquer my place under the sun of life." End of a quote. Dali makes sure that in every confrontation with his father, the son comes out the winner, and the father is the one who is sacrificed. At the age of 7, the day his father took him to school, the son walked all the way in a tantrum that gave him the satisfaction of having humiliated the pride of his father, a notorious and important figure, in the eyes of the people of Figueras. One has to remember that parents took their children to school by foot, so everyone could see the tantrum of the child. Dali concluded that this act of force accentuated his megalomania. There are many episodes of humiliation that the painter takes pleasure in recounting. The revenge on his father was, he says, prolong the pleasure of my own desire. So much so that he can say, and this is a quote, "My greatest voluptuousness would have been to sodomize my dying father." End of a quote. This confrontation with the father obviously is not of an Oedipal nature. In Dali, defeating the father is part of the megalomaniacal delusion, which functions as a substitute for the name of the father. I'm going to read another quotation in which we can see that is not the redeeming son who is resurrected after his sacrifice, but the father is resurrected through the son. The son redeems the father. There is a very singular version of the Redeemer. And I quote, "I had managed to appropriate his strength to overcome it," the strength of the father. What he did not know was that by directing him, I had also led him to his resurrection, and that he was revived through me. The whole secret of my genius lies in that asceticism of conquest and overcoming. End of a quote. This explanation is given at a moment that, according to Dali, it's a moment when, at the height of Dali's success as an artist, he visited his father in a Cadillac. And he thought that then he was the highest humiliation of the father. So this rectifying megalomaniacal ego was the wanting thread that knotted the unknotted. His genius was a compensation for a father who was not a father to him. Fascinating death. In his writing, Dali unravels his vicissitudes to conquer, he says, his place under the sun of life. On the one hand, there are his terrors and his fears, and on the other, his fascination with death. He said, I dream of restoring to death its solemnity and its fascination. There is a particularly poignant episode in which it is made clear the way in which the phallus incarnated death for Dali. The episode took place when Dali was 5 years old. It is developed in two scenes. The first one took place one afternoon and the other one the following morning. Dali went for a walk in the countryside with three beautiful young women, friends of the family. One of them was particularly beautiful. During the walk, he saw them whispering to each other and then asked him to go away. He felt jealous at this request, but agreed and hid to see what was going on. The most beautiful woman moved away, pulled up her skirt, bent down, and urinated. Dali describes in detail his fascination with the scene and the excrement. On his return, he felt that, I quote, my heart was torn between pleasure and resentment, end of a quote. When he got home, he met a cousin who had just come from hunting and gave him a bat with a wounded wing. Dali took the bat to the laundry room. That was the place where he kept his collection of insects and other animals. And the next morning, he found his boxes with animals open on the floor and the animals on the run, except for the bat, covered in ants and in agony. Says Dali, its tortured little face exposing tiny teeth like an old woman. At that moment, he saw through the window the beautiful woman who was the protagonist of the previous day's scene of jouissance. He picked up a stone and threw it at her. And although it did not touch her, the noise made her to turn and look at him. And I quote now, suddenly I committed an incomprehensible act that threw a shrill cry of horror from the young woman. With a lightning movement, I picked up the bat, crawling with ants, lifted it to my mouth, moved by an unsurmountable feeling of pity. But instead of kissing it, as though I was going to, I gave it such a vigorous bite with my jaws that it seemed to me I almost split it in two. End of a quote. This scene also reveals the extent of Dali's identification with the dead. There are other episodes in which the bodies of animals devoured by worms fascinate the child Dali. As an adolescent, he made several attempts of self-harm. His repeated passages to the act at school are worth mentioning. Dali threw himself down the stairs on more than one occasion. In the description of these moments, he describes the jouissance provoked by the fascinated and horrified gaze of his classmates on himself. Dali's mustache. On a visit to Portlligat is a tiny town in the Mediterranean coast north of Catalonia, where he lived. So on a visit to Portlligat, the great Catalan writer Josep Pla said to Dali, "This mustache will end up making a hole." Dali wrote it down on his diary on July 4th of 1952. The painter was delighted with the witticism, since the Catalan expression "to make a hole" means to leave a mark. The Catalan writer had grasped the preeminent place of the semblant in Dali's work. And we've seen an excellent example with the video this afternoon. So the Catalan writer had grasped the preeminent place of the semblant in Dali's work. A semblant is not a disguise, neither a mask. The success of the semblant in Dali can only be explained by the fact that it truly exercised its function as a semblant. It was not a mask, but, I quote Miller, a rim that borders a nucleus of jouissance. It is the definition that Miller gives of semblant in the presentation of the theme of the 7th Congress of the AMP, the World Association of Psychoanalysis. And I think that describes very well the function of the Dali's mustache. A rim that borders a nucleus of jouissance. We can say an envelope of jouissance. Dali writes that as a child, he liked to dress up in kingly costumes and wear a crown. As an adult, he discovered that his spiky mustache could carry out his mission more successfully. Dali's ego took support in a body, not as the specular image, but as part of his art work. Dali says that in private, he could be completely naked or without changing his clothes for days. But in public, he groomed himself scrupulously to the point of exaggeration. Dali tells how he began to realize that his overdone occurrences, his eccentricity, had an effect on others, and he learned to use it. Thus, at school, as a teenager, after beating and breaking the violin of a classmate, when the teacher questioned him about his act, he replied that he had broken the violin to demonstrate the superiority of painting over music. To the teacher's reproach, "This makes no sense," Dali replied, "Not to you, but my shoes don't think the same way." And he concludes, "I realized that my delusion could convince and subjugate." And indeed, it did. The woman. As with Joyce, for Dali, there is but one woman. The place that Gala had in his life is notorious. For my argument today, I will only repeat the phrase that Lacan says about Joyce's relationship with Nora. I quote, this is Lacan. "I will say that it is a sexual relation, even though if I say that such thing doesn't exist, but it's a funny old sexual relation." End of a quote. To fully develop this quote and Dali's relation with Gala, that would require another work, so I will leave it like this for the moment. Finally, to be God or to be Dali? Or to be Dali, yeah, to be God or to be Dali. I would like to mention an anecdote told not by him, but by a journalist, Agustí Fancelli, who took place in 1971. Those years were of effervescence in Spain. It was the end of the dictatorship, so it was... No, he died in 89, I think. Franco died in 75, so that was the end of the dictatorship. 4 years before the end, but there was already a lot of social upheaval during those years. So there was a music promoter, Oriol Regàs, that came up with the idea, together with the writer Manuel Vázquez Montalbán, a very important writer, a notorious figure. And the idea that Oriol Regàs had was that they could ask Dali for a rock opera. So the first conversation between the painter, I mean, can you imagine that moment, right? So there's a writer and a promoter young men, the end of a dictatorship in the 70s, and say, we're going to ask Dali for a rock opera. So it's one has to, right? Imagine the atmosphere. So the first conversation between the painter and the promoter took place in Port Lligat, in this beautiful town that I invite you all to visit because it's marvelous. Huh? Port Lligat, whenever you like, because it's a beautiful place to be. So anyway, the first conversation had place in Port Lligat, and the first draft of the script had about 15 lines, in which, in Dali's opinion, were more than enough for the poet, meaning Vázquez Montalbán, to expand it into a complete libretto. The painter, however, wrote another text in French, which he entitled Être Dieu, to be God. To work on it, they met in Paris at the Hotel Maurice, where Dali used to spend the autumn and part of the winter. Vázquez Montalbán writes, I quote, "We were sitting there, giving him conversation, provoking him, and taking written or mental notes, regardless of detestable historical positions. For me," says Montalbán, "seeing how Dali acted up during a few hours, and above all, getting to know the world of the Dalinians, was the most evocative experience. I would never have imagined that such people could exist. I suppose Elvis Presley's follower must have been similar, but the Dalinians had such grotesque cultural pretensions of exquisiteness and snobbery that you certainly needed Dali's skin to put up with it." End of a quote. On the basis of all this, Vázquez Montalbán drew up a 22-page libretto, which, when the recordings began, the painter did not want to follow. "Dali never repeats himself," said the artist, "and let himself be carried away by improvisation." Vázquez Montalbán, however, was the creator of the ironic phrase uttered several times by the narrator, a sentence that Dali loved, presumably not as an irony, but as the reality of his being. "But if you were God, you wouldn't be Dali."
Fantastic, the presentation and the personage. We shall begin now the conversation. I want you all to know that we decided that all the papers will be sent to you after every lesson. So this, I understand, is good news because I had many requests. Okay, so we begin our conversation. Thank you very much. It was fantastic.
I will add, while you think the questions, that there is so much. I mean, I'm not an expert on Dali, I'm not an expert on art, and there is so much about Dali that I only took the thread of the megalomania. But there are a lot of other things that one could take, but I thought that was enough. And I would like to mention that he met Freud, but he also met Lacan, and that in fact Lacan went to visit him. And there is a very beautiful description of the meeting that he had with Lacan. Here, in The Secret Life of Salvador Dali, I can read it to you. You want? Yeah? He had Dali had written an article about what he called the critical paranoid method. He's very famous for that, and he had this idea with this critical paranoid method, with paranoia, you could see things that were not obvious at first sight, which is right. And then he has a beautiful book on the Angelus by Millet. I don't know if you know that painting. Well, that would be another another thing. Perhaps we'll have time. If not, simply that was in the context of Dali writing this article, that the visit from Lacan to Dali takes place. And you'll find this in The Secret Life, which was an autobiographical book. Says Dali, I seem destined to a truculent eccentricity, whether I wish it or not. I was 33. One day in Paris, I received a telephone call from a brilliant young psychiatrist. He had just read an article of mine in the review Le Minotaure on the inner mechanism of paranoid activity. He congratulated me and expressed his astonishment to the accuracy of my scientific knowledge of this subject, which was so greatly misunderstood. He wished to see me and to talk over this whole question. We agreed to meet late that very afternoon in my studio on Rue Gauget. I spent the whole afternoon in a state of extreme agitation at the prospect of our interview, and I tried to plan in advance the course of our conversation. My ideas were so often regarded, even by my closest friends in the surrealist group, as paradoxical whims, tinged with genius to be sure, that I was flattered finally to be considered seriously in strictly scientific circles. Hence, I was anxious that everything about our first exchange of ideas should be perfectly normal and serious. While waiting for the young psychiatrist's arrival, I continued working from memory on the portrait of the Vicomtesse of Noailles, on which I was then engaged. This painting was executed directly on Cooper. The highly burnished metal cast mirror-like reflections, which made it difficult for me to see my drawing clearly. I noticed, as I had before, that it was easier to see what I was doing where the reflections were brightest. At once, that's important, I stuck a piece of white paper, half an inch square, on the end of my nose. Piece of paper. Okay. Its reflection made perfectly visible the drawing of the parts on which I was working. At 6 o'clock sharp, the appointed time of our meeting, the doorbell rang. I hurriedly put away my copper. Jacques Lacan entered, and we immediately launched into highly technical discussion. We were surprised to discover that our views were equally opposed, and for the same reasons, to the constitutionalist theories then almost unanimously accepted. We conversed for 2 hours in a constant dialectic tumult. He left with the promise that we would keep in constant touch with each other and meet periodically. After he had gone, I paced up and down my studio, trying to reconstruct the course of our conversation and to weigh more objectively the points on which our rare disagreements might reveal a real significance. But I grew increasingly puzzled over the rather alarming manner in which the young psychiatrist had scrutinized my face from time to time. It was almost as if the germ of a strange, curious smile would then pierce through his expression. Was he intently studying the convulsive effects upon my facial morphology of the ideas that stir my soul? I found the answer to the enigma when I presently went to wash my hands. This, incidentally, is at the moment when one usually sees every kind of question with the greatest lucidity. But this time the answer was given me by my image in the mirror. I had forgotten to remove the square of white paper from the tip of my nose. For 2 hours, I had discussed questions of the most transcendental nature in the most precise, objective, and grave tone of voice without being aware of this disconcerting adornment of my nose. What cynic could consciously have played this role through the end? It's beautiful, isn't it? Lacan didn't say anything. No.
Bueno, there were two men, very special men, we have to say.
Very special.
I think we can see his interest in psychoanalysis because throughout the text he's very close to his experience. He can describe very well the relationship between melancholia and paranoia and megalomania. He speaks about the proud exaltation of myself being paranoia. So he's very close to it.
Yeah, he's always speaks very highly of psychoanalysis, and I know that he was. I mean, this is an anecdote from not from his books, but I met. I worked with the son of the psychiatrist at Dali psychiatry, and at that time he was also treated by people that were close to psychoanalysis.
Dali was treated. Which kind of medicines did he take, you know?
No, I don't know.
Because then there were not a lot.
No, that I don't know, but that the psychiatrist who was his psychiatrist was close to the psychoanalytic.
It's interesting.
But he was very interested in Freud's work, and he met with Dali, with Lacan once more. So he always speaks of psychoanalysis as really something that I think that I don't know if he needed to psychoanalyze himself, but he found in Freud and the text of Freud something that certainly you can see that helped him to.
Well, as Schreber knew a lot about the psychic apparatus. So Dali seems to be that he knew a lot also. Now we see that the worst in the world is depression and melancholy.
Yeah.
The thing that you have to fly away from is depression and melancholy, which fits what you said this morning in the theoretical part.
Yeah, I think that this case really helps me to illustrate the theoretical part on this morning. And it's true that finally behind this eccentric figure and this megalomaniac figure, what we have is a subject that is dead and that he really has to save himself from the dead child. That is megalomania, it is melancholy, and that the only way he has to overcome this melancholy is with this investing his name with this megalomania.
It's an extraordinary point in your talk where you speak about the moment where he goes to the top of the tower, and that's clearly a moment where he is in mortal danger, absolutely going towards the kind of equation that would lead him to be the dead one, that he will be throwing himself off.
So to add something to what you say, I think that in this quote is very important that he says, the tower was calling me.
Yes. And the way you put it, the way that you write it in this paragraph, it's in the same paragraph that you speak about the lizard, which is
the lizard.
Would you say that was the elementary phenomenon, the phenomenon of perplexity, when he sees a lizard with two tails?
I understood it that way.
And it fits very well with the framework that we have for this workshop, namely the invention of delusion by Jacques-Alain, where you've got this moment of perplexity and then the construction of a delusion as a attempt at recovery. And in a way, that's why it's so extraordinary, the progression that you show between this moment and then the fact that, and then what does he do after that? He stuffs his face full of not cherries, but fruit from the tree.
Yeah, and that the description, there is something of a body event.
Yes.
So he goes and touches the animal and touches the lizard with two tails and puts his hand in the middle because there is the void, and that's the moment of perplexity. The void is the moment of perplexity. And then he goes and starts stuffing himself with fruit, and there is a moment in the way he describes that with that voluptuous fear that one can grasp perhaps what it was, a body event,
Yes.
and then the moment of
The calling.
the
He
calling of
found his vocation.
It's almost a hallucinatory moment.
He found his vocation as a megalomaniac in the calling from the tower, which was calling him to his death. But he responded by this identification with his ego as greatness, because this is what happened at that point. That it is, what did you say? That it's his moment where he understands that his path in life would be megalomaniacal, and from the top, the megalomaniacal idea takes shape, which will remain as a defense against the real. I wanted to know, you've been very clear and very careful to stay on the side of the writing and the real, as you say, rather than the true. But I wanted to know, if we look at the picture of Dali there up on the screen with his magnificent moustache, can we not see the two tails of the lizard
And the void.
and the void? So something there, almost like a symptom, like you have the side that you have the Lacan defined it as the recompense, the reduction of jouissance, but also the sign of the fault. In a way,
The sign of what?
The fault, the preservation of the fault. In a way, I'm just sort of improvising this, but you could see this megalomaniacal construction as responding perfectly to that moment of perplexity.
Now, another thing that I would like to add to Phil's observation is, in this case, we see the person in unbearable perplexity, not because of something that happened in his head, but something he sees, the lizard with the two tails. Now, a lizard could be a phallic symbol, but two tails means castration, because Freud said one is phallic, two is castrated. So this points the moment, the contingent moment in which he faces castration.
And castration under the form of two, because it's him and the brother.
Yeah, yes.
And there is the sentence when he sentence which says, "I am not going to be the one sacrificed." Yeah. So there is a decision of the subject there. It says, "I'm not going to be the one sacrificed," and the sacrifice is the father, or the other, or the child, or whoever. But he says, "I am not going," because, that's the moment in which he saves himself from the dead child. Yeah.
Another thing I would add when you think about your questions, the public, is that in Donk, in the seminar, the connection that Miller stresses about the ego is the push towards sacrifice that entails the structure of the ego. The ego leading to sacrifice, because leads to identity, therefore sacrifice.
To submit to the master that I was saying.
Yes, and here is as if he would have said, yes, the ego, but in the two possibilities, I can choose one. I won't be the sacrifice.
Exactly.
But there is a sacrifice
There's
that
a sacrifice,
has to be done.
And it will be the other.
Will be the other.
The other.
Yes.
Yeah.
Nice person.
A question, could we say that the way he treats the waste object, turning it to an agalmatic object, is similar to the way he moves from the melancholia to megalomania? Can we make this analogy?
It's interesting that you put it in this way. I was thinking that for him, the phallus is always the dead phallus, because the phallus is the brother and the brother is the dead brother. So the function of the excrement or the waste object, I think that it's also played in this dialectics. And he says, I will make of the excrement, I will make the object, the agalmatic object. And this is what he did with himself. And it's what he did with himself, and from being the waste to be this genius. But the interesting here is that he made himself this genius artist as a megalomania. So it's not that what's interesting about that is that he says, I am megalomaniacal. I am this great ego. We don't know. It's difficult to know what is the meaning for him of this. When he says megalomania, but this is what I think it's
The base.
Yeah.
The basis of my art, he said in the video clip, is delusional.
Exactly.
It's extraordinary.
Yeah.
Extraordinary.
But it's true that because when I was preparing and reading all this, there is something about the way he writes. He writes very well, as you can see, and perhaps. Yeah, Spanish and English and French. I think that he never wrote in Catalan. No, he was a supporter of Franco. He was a supporter of Hitler. That's why Breton threw him out of the surrealist group. And he says that his identification with the tyrant. He says that, and that's why Vázquez Montalbán says it's no disagreement in historical facts. So it's true that when one reads about him, one thinks that there is something despicable of him as a person. But then there's another way of looking at it. He didn't become a mass murderer. He didn't become a dictator. He became an artist. So in a way, there is something. There is something. I don't know if we can say ethical, no. But from throwing down a poor 5-year-old child down the bridge to making these performances, there is for this subject a big effort, I think.
But he was maybe he was also a coward,
as he says in the quote.
That's why he didn't kill, and he was not a tyrant.
That's why he says my cowardice in this quote, right?
Yes.
In this quote down the.
He knows everything, so he didn't have to spend money in psychoanalysis.
But he spent on psychiatrist. Huh?
Well, thank you. I was thinking about different from Schreber, because Schreber has a private delusion. He had a delusion that makes some loud, some. I thought very interesting when you said about the Dalinians. I would like to ask you if you know something more about it. And I remember a quotation of Miller when he said that delusion is a symbolic tale capable of ordering a world. Maybe these Dalinians order their world with something about this Salvador. What do you think? Thank you. The Dalinians, if you know more about the Dalinians, because I thought it's interesting when you said, he said, I am megalomaniac, but it's his megalomaniac makes something a kind of people identifies with this megalomaniac. It produces. As we saw other megalomaniacs that produces a lot of things. In my country, in Brazil, we see this in politics. A lot of people glue in a megalomaniac man. So,
not only in South America.
Yeah, sure. That the way Vázquez Montalbán describes these Dalinians were probably very, very snobbery. And there are some episodes in which Dali tells that people went to him to ask him for advice, how to become a great writer or a great painter. And he was very despicable with them as well. Huh? But yeah, I'm sure that he attracted not the most... not the nicest people. Sure.
I have again a question about something I'm not sure I understood. Why is it that when you quoted him, that he said, thanks to me, the day will come when people will be forced to concern themselves with my work. That is much more effective than groping for one's personality through one's work. And from here, you say, as your conclusion, what is the painter from Figueres telling us here, if not that it is through his name that he will be able to attract interest in his work? Why do you put the name in the front?
I could have put the mustache. No, I think that it's Dali, the interest is in Dali, in the character. And then the interest in the character, as I think we can see also in the videos that show that there's a lot of interest in this extravagant, this personality, and more that in his work. And I think that this relates really to what Lacan says about Joyce, and he says, and not that one will be interested in his work, and then from his work be interested in the man. I think that Dali says, no, they'll be interested in me, and from me they'll go to my work. The name as a rectifying ego, if I may say so.
Quite the opposite of most of the artists.
Absolutely, yeah.
That they fade
behind. Huh?
They fade behind their work.
Exactly.
And the work fades behind him.
Exactly, yeah.
Let's hear your thoughts and your questions. You don't have to be megalomaniac in order to speak here.
It's a very general comment, but picking up on something you said in the morning about delusions of grandiosity being linked to the other, and the other of that particular moment, the discourse, the common discourse. There's something, maybe it relates to what you said about some kind of ethical decision somewhere in Dali's trajectory. It's hard to imagine him becoming an artist other than when he did and in the way he did, because he really made himself into a brand. And even in some of those childhood scenes, there's a sense that the attention of others is this crucial element that gives him his existence, and he creates situations to attract attention. And people talk these days about the attention economy, look at me. Something about the historical context and the way art was going perhaps in a more sort of commercial direction really made it possible for him to turn his delusion into a sort of success story. And he uses it, the scene of turning up with a Cadillac to humiliate his father. I mean, that was possible because he was so incredibly successful. Yes.
Yeah, it's true that one wonders how more difficult would be nowadays for a child to become an artist the way Dali did. And you said something that I think it's very important, is that he always played on attracting the other's attention, because there is the scene when he goes to Molida La Torre, and he doesn't jump. But then when he went to school, he threw himself out the stairs many times, but he only threw himself down the stairs if the others were looking at him. And when he had this terrible tantrum when his father took him to school, he describes everyone in the village looking at him. So it's true that the gaze of the other gave him that consistency that we were talking about, that was lacking, and that was very important. And also with the Cadillac, it would be, who had a Cadillac in Spain in the 50s? No one. And also the question with the excrement, he wanted to be millionaire, and he said that he wanted to be millionaire, and Breton called him Avida Dollars. That is an acronym from his name, Salvador Dali, Avida Dollars, right? And that's what Breton named him. So he wanted to make a lot of money, and he made money in the States. He went to the States and he made lots and lots and lots of money. He wanted that.
Hi. Thank you so much for your presentation. I think it's very generous that you explain so well, and it's like I feel like very easily to follow. I would like to know if Salvador mentioned to feeling free, because as you mentioned, like we are slaves of our ego. So I feel like maybe he expressed somehow his feelings about overcoming this and feeling more free. I don't know if in the book maybe he expressed something about freedom. Or...
Yeah, well, he has to save himself from being a slave of the other. But what he does is he's a master of the other, and we see that the way there are lots and lots of examples in which he really humiliates his father, and he takes a lot of pleasure on doing that. So he really needs to be the one that dominates the other in a kind of a sadistic way. And so there's one example, another one because he says that he loved his mother a lot, but he made an exhibition, and that was one of the occasions in which he had a row with his father. He made an exhibition in Paris, and he put a portrait of his mother that was dead at the time, and a sentence that says, "I spit on you on your portrait every day." On the mother, yeah. And the father asked him to remove that, and he said no. And that was a big moment of tension. So really, he had to destroy he had to break through even the image of the mother.
Well, actually, my question was regarding the mother, because I felt that there was a missing from today's presentation. The father was sort of denigrated and sort of attacked violently, but the mother and sort of the whole idea about the void and sort of the emptiness he was feeling and the lack of the removal of the affection as he was growing up. And interestingly, in the video, he mentioned that he was the savior of the painters, of the void in the painters or the artist community. I don't know, this image of saving the mother somehow came. My question was a bit more about the relationship with the mother.
Yeah. The only thing he says is that his mother was wonderful, that he loved her so much, but really there is not much. So it's at least for him, it was an absence. You can feel the absence of the mother in all his writings, whereas you don't see the father, which, well, tells us something about the desire of the mother. And the only thing he does is this portrait of the mother that he says that. So he really has no respect at all with the semblance. And I think that gives it this daringness. But in fact, finally, what it is that he doesn't respect the semblance, and we see that with the fact that he can poo all over the house in all places, and that he can throw the child down the bridge. He really has no respect for the semblance, and then the only semblance he can build is his own. So,
Yes, just to maybe on the subject of the mother, because it seems to me that we find his mother on his paintings mostly, and especially in his very late period, where there is a certain idealization of the female figure in the form of the Madonna. And in a sense, this is how he portrays Galia, in a sense that he kind of raises her, to use your expression, to the dignity of the Madonna, of the divine figure, and that's the only thing there is left of his mother.
I really don't know if I don't know. Really, when I say I don't know, it's like that. I don't know if we can draw a relationship between Gala and the mother figure. I think that one thing it's a whole field to explore, but Gala is the woman. So when Lacan says, which is very I find this quote, to very, very, very interesting when Lacan says, I will say that it is, talking about Joyce and Nora, I will say that it is a sexual relation, even though if I say that such a thing doesn't exist, because it's true that we all know that Lacan says there is no sexual relation, but he says about Nora and Joyce, I will say that that is a sexual relation. And it's a sexual relation because for Joyce, I suppose, Nora was the woman, but certainly for Dali, Gala was the woman. But the fact that it wasn't the woman doesn't mean that he adored her in a way that worshiped her and that treated her very well. And no, it was something completely different. There is a moment in which Gala has to have a surgery of a very serious nature, and Dali drives her to the hospital, and then he leaves and he spends the whole afternoon painting and forgetting, completely about Gala, and the next day goes to see her at the hospital and thinks, when I saw her, I wanted to kill her. So the fact that the woman exists for a man can be something dreadful. So I think that I will require a lot more work, which I haven't done it. But I can say that for Dali, the woman existed, and that also has a terrible side to it.
There have been several questions about Gala that you don't have to answer. I don't think we'll dwell on Gala any too much more, but just to say, there have been lots of questions about Gala, his relationship with Gala in the chat. I didn't realize that Gala had her own castle, apparently, as well as anything else. But as far as I remember, if I can read what they say, please say something more about Gala and their relationship. That's one question. Another one, could Neus say something more about the particular function of Gala, wife and muse? From the little that I know, she was a force to be reckoned with herself. She lived apart from him in her own Gala castle, and Dali had to write to ask permission to visit. Another person writes, thank you very much for your great work and presentation. I would like to ask you about Gala's place or role. If I heard you correctly, you have said that the relationship with Gala made the sexual rapport exist. It denied the whole of non-rapport. Also, thinking about Gala's omnipresence in her artworks, or his artworks perhaps. Please, could you say something more about this? Thank you. But I think you may have covered it, but as you wish.
Yeah, it's one of the ways that we can say that there is no sexual rapport is because when Lacan says in many places that when one woman meets a man, doesn't meet with the man, it's the phallus and the other way around. So there is always the phallus in between the man and the woman. That makes that the sexual relation doesn't exist. It's one way of explaining this sentence. So I think that if we can think why Lacan says that in the case of Joyce and Nora, and I think that we can probably make the hypothesis that this is the same with Dali and Gala, is, as I said, because for Dali, Gala was the woman, and if the woman exists, then Lacan says in Seminar 22, said that if the woman existed, that would be the goddess of castration. So it would be the terrible goddess. I don't know enough about the relationship between Dali and Gala. There is a lot has been written on it. And as I said, I've stuck to the things that Dali says, because I wanted to be, in a way, strict with psychoanalysis, looking for the real and not for the true. But this moment in which he describes his state when Gala has to go through surgery, and then the whole he talks a lot about the little girls that he fell in love when he was young, and they all, when he writes this, when he's in his 30s, all these girls bear the name of Gala. So for him, there is only one woman, and that is Gala. It doesn't matter if it was a little girl that he met, that he fell in love, that he played with, all the fantasies of women. If they embody something feminine for him, they are Gala. And this is all I know.
1936. Before 1936, Dali produces rather brilliant but very conventional paintings in the manner of things that were already happening. In 1936, he gets thrown out of art school. The Spanish Civil War starts. He goes to Paris and lives in Paris, meets Picasso, all sorts of people. Is there anything psychoanalytical that we can say happens in 1936, or is it just a date that something starts suddenly? We don't know anything.
I couldn't answer this question. It's interesting. I really couldn't answer. It's true that 36 is an open wound in Spain, so 36, 39, but I don't know. I really couldn't. I think, yeah.
One final question. Lacan asked Jacques Aubert, whether Joyce believed that he was a redeemer. There were traces, he said. Can we speak about Dali's relation to his delusion as belief?
That's a good question. Perhaps? That's a very good question, because when you read that, when you read what he says, I pose myself this question: is a belief, or is a delusion? There's something certainty? And I think that it's interesting, because what I could say now is that there is a certainty in Dali, and at the same time, there is a certain notion that his certainty is delusional. This is the idea that one gets, or that I got when I was reading him, because he overdoes everything so much. He exaggerates everything so much that he turns his own delusion into a semblance. That's like the mustache. I think that is so particular about him, and it what distinguishes his delusion from any other delusion. So you can feel this, you can hear, or no, you can read the certainty in what he says, and at the same time, the semblantization of what he says. La semblantización of what he says. And that is very, very singular of his enunciation. I think that at one moment, one doubts that he turns his enunciation is in the paradigm of the semblant. I think that is what, for me, what started to become clear as I was reading his text, his enunciation.
Could we take this as a way of understanding how in psychosis the effect of truth doesn't take place?
Exactly.
And only putting together a certainty to cope with the unbearable.
Exactly. I think that is
no truth.
No truth, but
that's why a delusion is the only coin that could be a coin you can give at the Bitcoin that you can give instead of a truth.
But exactly. I always helps me a lot in my clinic is something that I heard once that Antonio Di Chacha said, that the success of the treatment with a psychotic subject is to make him believe in the semblant, and that's the success.
Because you can't arrive with him to the other aspect of psychoanalysis, meaning the effects of truth that you can.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Salvador Dali is a very, very successful, unique case of megalomania. But I wonder how we can open it up, because I think we see elements of the logic of this case in our clinics. We see the kind of the narcissistic compensation and its other side, which is the waste object. What can we say about that? About who we encounter in the clinic today that has this narcissistic, component? And we have, I think it links to what you were saying in the morning about with identification, protecting it.
It's a good question. How do we deal, in our clinics with narcissism when we encounter or with the ego, not narcissism really, but with the ego? How we deal with that in a moment in which the ego is being so promoted. Last week we had a session preparing for the Congress people in Barcelona, and a colleague, Jorge Sosa, gave a presentation, and he entitled his paper the depathologizing. Those words are so difficult. Depathologizing and the rise of the ego. And he made a connection between this idea of, depathologizing and the fact that promotes the ego. And it's a very interesting point, because that's what we find. When we say, no, I am autistic. I don't want this to be a pathology because I am, and because it's the way I am, and I want to be like this. So it's true that this is what we encounter, and for us, for psychoanalysis, we don't aim at the diagnosis, but at the singularity of it. Trying to find the particular, what is only of this subject and not of any other. And it is a challenge. It's a challenge nowadays how we deal with that, because it depends on what the subject brings. But in any case, never the path of psychoanalysis is to promote the ego, unless is what Lacan says in seminar 23, a rectifying ego, that is something that that gives a knot between the body, the name, and the symptom. Unless it's that, as a rectifying ego, the function of psychoanalysis is not to promote the ego, and contrary to all other kinds of therapies that are being promoted. That we find lots of people who come to our consultation rooms, and they say, my problem is I have a low self-esteem. So I think that it is an indication for us never to take the path of the ego. Probably not even with psychosis. One thing is to accompany the subject so that the subject believes that the semblant can deal with the real, and something else is to promote the ego. So at least psychoanalysis is that.
Can you say something about the relation between the semblant and the ego? Since you mentioned them together.
Well, the semblant is what Miller, the definition I gave of the semblant. I looked for several, see which one I could find that would make in one sentence. And the semblant is what can cover the void, the object, the void that the object is, right? So the semblant is a treatment of the real, in the sense that is something symbolic that can cover something that is void, that is real. Right? That is the function of the real. The way Miller says it in this sentence, he says it's like a rim that borders a void, and that's the closest that we can give as a definition of the semblant. So there are a few things that can be a semblant. The father is a semblant in the sense that is something that covers precisely a void, which is the real and the lack of sexual relation, finally. So the function of the real is always that, the function of the semblant, and is a defense against the real, because it's something that can border it. So a few things for a subject can do the function of the real. The ego as such is something, as we saw it this morning, is something different. It's something that whether articulates the idea of the imaginary and the symbolic, the body image, or else gives a consistency to the body, or gives an idea of oneself. There are different ways in which we can approach the question of the ego. But I don't think that we could say that the ego is a semblant. I would have to think about it.
Did you say the semblant is more the symbolic?
No, it's not the symbolic. It's how from the symbolic. In fact, there is a triangle that Miller does in the nature of the semblance, and put the semblant in the arrow that goes from the symbolic to the real. So it's how with the symbolic one can reach something of the real. That's why he says is what veils it's what a rim that borders the object, a rim that borders the void, and that's the function. So it goes from the symbolic to the real. That's why later on Lacan can say that the phallus is a semblant, the father is a semblant. Not everything. Only certain things can be a semblant, as long as they can try from the symbolic to grab something of the real.
You certainly see what happens when the function of the semblant fails in the melancholic actions. It's just the real, and that's what gives a really poignant idea of what's at stake in this idea that your definition of the treatment of psychosis aiming towards giving the subject some belief in the semblant. It's really, I think it's very important.
Whereas the ego is certainly in the register of the imaginary at first, and always in a way. Yeah?
In the meantime, when Phil is drawing something, it's interesting that the next seminar will be on delusions of self-accusations, which is interesting that it comes exactly after this about the, yes. And also we shall see that Veronique Bonus, the last time she was criticizing the way we use the word real, and she wanted to be, so we shall have with her again some discussion of what is the connection between the semblant and the real and the void. Can you explain what you...
On the board, I simply put the triangle that Neus was referring to from Encore, where we see the triangle between, I'll say it for the people on Zoom, the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real, going around from the top anti-clockwise. And you just have the semblant being precisely what connects the symbolic to the real. And it's the triangle that people can remember in their minds. I can't remember what page it's from in the Encore, but there is the point where jouissance emerges in a kind of balloon from the real. Neus referred to it in order to situate where the function of the semblant lies.
Now, could you agree to the idea that one way he had to stick to his semblant and to make it something that works for him was about destroying the semblant that the other has built for himself, going through Figueres, making a mess in the street. and making his father feel terrible, is that he's attacking the father's semblance, and not only spitting on the mother's portrait, but writing "I spit on you" is like destroying the semblance of that has been built in the Bible. Don't touch the mother and honor your parents. So he's spitting on the semblance that are built in the culture, and from this he makes money, and he makes his name and his ego. Okay, I wouldn't be a friend of his.
No.
And yeah, I think you were right when you pointed out the importance of his art for Dali, the kind of ethical dimension that stops him becoming a dictator, let's say. I mean, not for nothing that we mentioned Franco, and the aggressivity is, well, what is the word? Because this touches on a question in the Zoom. Did Dali engage in sublimation? Can you say something about that? It's a word that, after all, yes, it's after all a word that he used himself in the video, if you heard it. So could you say something about that?
Yeah, I think that when he talks so much about the excrement and all that, I think that he has in mind the idea of sublimation. But, well, you know that at the end, Lacan didn't really buy on the idea of sublimation, this Freudian idea, because finally the Saint-Homme doesn't sublimate anything. It's a way of making with the rest. And I think that this is what we find in Dali. He makes with the rest. That's finally what it is. Yeah, the waste. Yeah, the remainder. Yeah. But I think that it's very important. What is appeared here is the fact that he destroys the semblance. He destroys the semblance in order to raise his own semblance. That is part of his megalomania. Yeah.
We return, if there are no other questions, we return to the moustache.
Yes.
I mean, the moustache was something, I think it surprised me that it was, you've foregrounded it a lot. It's surprised, even on the name of a file, I think moustache was the name. You sent this picture that we put on the board, especially something you mentioned, the insignia before.
Yes.
In a way, what's, can we tease out is what's the relation between the moustache and the insignia? But people may not have heard in that clip, the funny clip from What's My Line, he apparently, there was a reference to him painting with his moustache, actually painting with his moustache, that Dali seemed to, it must have been something from that time, from that moment. And also in the other clip where he was being interviewed by the art, about the art and the painting, precisely he was saying, it's my inspiration. It's very practical for my work, he said. I raise it, and it's precisely the gay emblem in the Dali sense, opposed to the melancholia.
Yes, but also at night they fall down. No, in the morning, he says. No, at night they fall down. I think that it's the fact that we can pick on the moustache as semblance tells us something about the nature of the semblance, which is that the semblance is not something, can be something enormous or something. It's precisely these two thin moustaches, and all his megalomaniacal ego is a constant or is grounded on this moustache. And I think that that's what's so relevant to understand the rectifying ego in this subject. And I want to say something of talking about the waste and the agalma object, that in this video also Dali says that sometimes when he finished eating and with his greasy fingers, he touches his moustache to make them stick up. Exactly.
He started.
That's when he started. So it's very, here we see that behind the most agalmatic thing for him is always the excrement. And I think that that is what the semblant, the function of the semblant is that for him.
And would you agree to the idea that, in fact, this mustache and the work he had to put on it is an example of being the ego is the master?
Exactly.
So he has to comply to the demands of his ego and working on his mustache every day.
Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, we can say that as well. Sure. Uh-huh. Yeah.
In Zoom?
Yeah.
No, not at the moment. But I wanted to ask about another trait that features prominently in his work, and that could also be described as one of his insignias or something like that, namely the prop. Perhaps I'm not using the right word, but things are propped up in his painting. The crutch, the function of this
the function of the crutch.
The function of the support, as if the body is falling and would fall if it wasn't for this support. In the paint, there are lots of paintings where the melting forms are propped up by the crutch, but also he has a cane.
A muleta.
Could you say something about that? And if you want to use a different word than crutch, you may.
No. He talks about the crutch in his childhood. There is a whole episode about the crutch that there was a crutch. He found a crutch and he started using it. And one of the things he used is he really was, he was, what do you call la piel del diablo? How do you say that? Devil. There's an expression, He found this crutch and he played with it. And then there was this poor, like a servant that was cleaning some window. And then he went from behind with the crutch and put it in the breast of the poor woman. So he was mean, so the idea of the crutch is something that he shows a lot of interest. And it's true that there is always a decaying body for him and he needs the crutch. But there is something of the jouissance that can, is a crutch for the jouissance that can animate the body, because if not, the body is the decay of the body, the melancholy. Yeah.
Do you know if he had sex with his wife?
Well, a lot of things are said about it. And I'm not going to say anything more. Okay.
I was trying to remember something about Dali's house. He's got one on the coast somewhere that's kind of a museum.
Portligat.
Yeah. And I was looking at images just now to try to remember something about it that was different to what I found. But there's a turret in the house, a tower, and on top of the tower is a big egg. And also in the Dali museum, on the top of the tower is a big egg. There's something interesting about this moment in the tower in his childhood and the creation that he did there.
Yeah, I don't know anything more about it, but it's in,
Just a quick one. I came across a lot of megalomaniac men in my personal life, and I'm just wondering whether in your clinic, do you come across megalomaniac women as well? And how often?
What an interesting question. Very interesting. Because if I think of my cases, they're all male.
A woman speaks.
Yeah. Perhaps, I'm thinking aloud, which one should not do in front of a screen when recording is in progress. But perhaps what I could say now is because narcissism in women is so widely accepted that can mask certain megalomania. But sure, when I was looking for cases of megalomania to see what I could present today, I found some cases of megalomaniac women. But I was saying this morning, and I think that nowadays we don't find those delusions of megalomania because of medication. There are some, but when the some people, there are some megalomaniac women in hospitals with a delusion of grandiose delusion. But these features of megalomania that you find sometimes in certain subjects, perhaps I don't know, perhaps in women, that passes in a more disguised manner. I don't know. It's just a
now that we are talking about it, I think in very, very rich women, you can find this in the way they exert authority and power through the money. Could be a megalomaniac trait.
But don't you think that perhaps that passes by in a disguised manner or not?
Yes, it's because it looks like very masculine.
Yeah.
Yes.
Just a comment to say, and remember also Laurent Dupont was not responding to questions around women because it's very difficult to speak about what kind of woman. And remember also Eric Laurent saying that there is no narcissism in a woman, and that's why the other has to speak about her and give words, because the relationship to the phallus is not the same. So it's how to distinguish all these women.
You have 1 minute and a half to bring a question, or you have to. Eh? I think we had a very, very, very exciting, very good connection, very transmissive day. It's very clear that you like to teach, and we enjoyed that very, very much. And I thank you very, very much. And we all hope to see you often in London. And also, I have to say one thing. Once Neus said, sitting at the table in Lausanne, that the first time she read Lacan, which reading Lacan is quite a quiet thing, she read Lacan first in English, not being English the mother language. So I really, from that day on, I really admire her. Because she survived that. Chapeau. Good. So thank you very, very much.